In today's lecture, we'll be looking at Chapter 14 of the text concerning the impact of higher education on police forces. There's been an understanding for a long time that having college-educated officers is beneficial for police departments. It really became a big push from the federal government and sort of imposing that on local governments following the establishment of the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration in 1968. And shortly after that, the formation of the Law Enforcement Education Program to funnel the funds that were being allocated at the federal level to local departments to do things like tuition assistance or completely paying for officers' education. There was also a lot of funds allocated for that in the Crime Control Act 1994, which put a lot of new officers on the streets. Over 100,000 new officers were hired based on the funds allocated with that act at the federal level. So it shows that there's been a push for a long time for trying to get more highly educated officers in police departments. There also have been more requirements at the federal level for having college education than at the state and local level. Yeah. So some of the issues that we've seen, even with the implementation of this, is that the system that was in place in 1968 wasn't the best. And we've addressed a lot of those issues, a lot of these issues that we'll talk about here since then. But initially, there were these problems that have been found to be hindrances for the development of the education of officers at local and state departments. The first is basically just what's being taught, what type of programs are being offered. Is it based on research? Is it based on just what the individual instructor has had experience with? So what is being taught was very important, and it's been very important to change that, to adapt it to what types of things the officers need to learn. A lot of the topics we've talked about over the course of the semester: de-escalation of force, cultural understanding, mental health identification and training, things like that. It's also important as to where the officers are getting their college credit. In the past, officers that were in these programs, typically 2-year degree programs, would be able to receive a certain amount of college credit just from doing the required departmental training. And that's problematic twofold. One, you're giving them credit for something that the university doesn't have any control over. And two, they would have done that anyway, so you're basically reducing the number of hours that it takes for them to get a diploma. And it's not really the point that they have the diploma, it's what they learn while they're getting it that has the impact. Also, with the identified necessity for restructuring, a lot of these programs had in place kind of cookie cutter police education programs that weren't tied to the larger field of criminology, and were basically formalizing and really just rehashing a lot of the things that they learned in the police academies, which again, they're not really exposing themselves to any type of new training or education. They're only relying on, again, a rehash of what was happening. And part of that was because the people that they were hiring to teach these programs were basically ex-law enforcement personnel. There is a benefit to having hands-on experience in this field, but that's not the be-all, end-all. There are a lot of things that can only be learned on the streets, but one of the things that we've been trying to do with this refocusing on higher education is to remove some of that street mentality, to look at alternate ways to handle situations or to educate and better our officers. So again, sticking to the status quo of the blue wall, the old boys network, really wasn't beneficial for putting these officers through those programs. To that point, looking at why an individual wants to teach, is it because they're retired and they're just bored as an officer, or are they trying to better the officers that are coming into the department? Are they looking to change what's happening? Are they looking to have officers that are better prepared to handle problems in their own communities? So getting people that have experienced the best person would be someone that has experienced the field practice of criminal justice, also gone through the entire master's PhD educational process, so that they can have both sides and both inputs into what they teach and what they expose the new students to. It's also important as to find officers that have started the educational process either before or at the same time that they're starting the policing process. You don't want them to have a lot of bad habits ingrained that then have to be sort of unlearned. It's better if they can just be focused on learning both sides, the in practice, the field, and also the sort of research, the criminology world of this field at the same time. So again, it's better if they start that higher education before, or at the latest when they're starting the police program, but trying to unlearn and relearn after you've already been exposed to the in practice field of policing can be make the process more difficult. This is a chart taken from the text. I'm examining the requirement for education in terms of the hiring process for local police departments. As you can see, from 1993 to 2013, we see that there's any requirement doubles from 15% to over 32%. We see a large increase in requirements for a 2-year degree, but not so much for a 4-year degree. So again, there's not really that focus on the department may be focused on hiring officers with a 4-year degree, but it's problematic to make it a requirement because then it makes it more difficult for them to have suitable recruits. A lot of recruits wouldn't have that. And there has been issues in the past with the requirement of a college education, a 2-year degree or a 4-year degree, being looked at as discriminatory because non-white community members obtain those degrees at lower frequencies. By then making it a requirement, you're putting structural blocks in place from them becoming police officers, much like the height requirement was in place to prevent women from becoming police officers in the past. The educational requirement, and when it's applied, has been seen as a potentially discriminatory issue in the past. That is something that could be addressed going forward if you are educating officers when or as you're hiring them. And if you have tuition assistance, it doesn't matter what background the person has. If they get hired, then they would then be educated, and that would reduce the necessity for them having outside means by which to seek their education. Some of the impacts that we've seen for college-educated officers, make sure to read the supplemental reading posted for this week. But as far as the attitudes, they tend to have a more sort of copacetic attitude where they're not less aggressive, more they do more inquiry in a situation as opposed to just assuming that they know what's happening, looking at both sides, and those can be very important tools when trying to prevent a situation from escalating, making sure that everyone's side is heard. As far as performance, they generally have better performance records in terms of having complaints against them. There are fewer complaints, more good markups in terms of their cooperation with the prosecutor's office. They have better writing skills, which makes it easier for the prosecution to take the information and the evidence that's gathered by the police and put it into a presentable case at trial. They have lower levels of use of force, and then if force is used, they have lower levels of force that is used. So the instances of force are lessened, and when they do use force, they use less of it. We've also seen a lot of requirements for promotions. based on education, that officers have to have a certain level of educational attainment to move up in the rank. That has helped to reduce the pool of potential applicants for those positions, so the officers know what kind of educational requirement they have to move up, and that makes that situation a little bit less competitive than we had seen in the past, at least in terms of raw number of applicants. It's still a very competitive process who's going to be hired in a police department, but you're looking at less qualified applicants by having a requirement for educational attainment. The one issue where it's become it doesn't help particularly is with job satisfaction. A lot of studies have been conducted about police job satisfaction and educational attainment have shown that officers with higher educational attainment will typically show lower levels of job satisfaction, and part of that is the nature of police work, that has been traditionally a job that has been available for people with lower levels of educational attainment, so they can almost feel like outsiders. There's also not necessarily the intellectual stimulation that some individuals would seek in police operations and writing tickets and doing paperwork and things like that. So it's kind of a two-front issue where they are, the educated officer, and also the nature of the job being somewhat non-stimulating, can make them exhibit lower levels of job satisfaction. Potentially more likely to leave policing for other occupations. That could be related. It could be going to law school or starting a private investigation firm, something like that. But they have been shown to exhibit lower levels of job satisfaction. There are a lot of programs that departments have instituted in terms of tuition reimbursement, paying for tuition, but those are hit pretty hard when you have things like a lot of civil lawsuits levied against a police department. Those are some of the first things that get cut, which is sort of counterintuitive because through their application, you could reduce the likelihood of those negative events happening in the future. But that's not necessarily what happens. Those incentive programs are great when they work, when they're implemented. But like I said, there is the problem of them being cut very early when funding issues do arise. Okay, so that basically wraps up the chapter on education. Make sure to read the supplemental reading on iCollege. We're not going to have a lecture for the last chapter. The chapter is about emerging issues. I want you all to read that chapter and think about all the things that we've talked about over the course of the semester. The uses of force issues that we've talked about, the high-profile issues that we've seen take place over the last 6 months, the issues with mental health care and the police department and what they're expected to do currently and what they should be doing, what we should be doing better as a society, the issues with the war on drugs. We've talked about that throughout the entire course of the semester. So think about the things that we've talked about over the course of the semester when you're reading that last chapter, and think about what things need to change now and what things could be changed now and what things we need to start getting better about working at as a society going forward. Hopefully with the ability over the next, let me just pick a random number of years, the next 4 years or 8 years, we can start to work to improve our society, improve everyone's position in our society, and improve the job that the police do for us, and also improve the job that we expect police officers to do. So again, just make sure you read that last chapter and think about the things that are happening right now, and how what the authors wrote several years ago compares to what's actually taking place right now.